On today's special edition of The Conversation, I will be speaking to Mark Thompson of Relatives for Justice, given the reaction to yesterday's judgment by a High Court judge sitting as a coroner into the unlawful killings of 4 IRA volunteers in February 1982. Mark will be here to discuss the judgment and, of course, give further context into the killings. Mark, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me in, Seán.
So, first of all, Mark, can you give us a bit of context into exactly what happened in February 1982?
Well, 4 IRA volunteers were shot in a hail of bullets. Almost 600 bullets were fired at them in Clonoe Car Park Chapel in the Coal Island area after an IRA operation where they had attacked an empty RUC station. And what transpired in that gunfire, initially the RUC and the British government had said that there was a firefight between 4 IRA volunteers and a specialist military unit that had been lying in wait on them arriving at the Chapel Car Park. What has transpired now is that there was never a firefight. The IRA had mounted an attack, a propaganda attack on an empty RUC station, and they essentially shot concrete. So when they arrived at the Chapel Car Park to dismantle and leave, the SAS were waiting on them and they killed them. Yesterday, a judge sitting as a coroner, a High Court judge in Belfast, had declared the killings effectively to be unlawful. All 4 of the men were shot, 2 whilst running away, and then shot as they lay incapacitated, executed on the ground, and 2 others were executed. There was an opportunity to make safe and effective arrest under the rule of law and to bring people before courts to face due process. And instead, the UK government, as they have done in many of these so-called set-piece shoot-to-kill incidents, ambushes, they've determined to kill people rather than to proceed with due process. So all the parameters and all the issues around protection of life and safeguarding and safe and effective arrest were dispensed with. And this was basically a murder operation. One of the senior officers, a colonel known as Colonel A, called it the kill zone. And what has transpired is that these men were under intensive surveillance night and day for weeks and days leading into this attack. They posed no threat when they reached the car park, and then they were ambushed in a hail, as I say, of 600 bullets. Now, there's been huge reaction to this from politicians and former British soldiers saying that the judge doesn't know what he's talking about, that this is 30 odd years later, he hasn't examined the facts. Well, the judge examined in great detail the pathology, the ballistics, the forensics. There were experts that looked at the scenes. If the scene was recreated visually in every context, the scene was visited. He relied on a lot of the statements made initially at the time by all of these soldiers. And he has determined that it was never effectively and properly investigated. Indeed, he has said it was covered up. And he has said that the men were unlawfully killed. And the reaction, the broader reaction to that has been one of violence and vilification of these families. These families and they're victims of the conflict. These families have had to endure 33 years to wait on an inquest and a verdict that was delivered yesterday. And throughout that period, they had been harassed and harangued. Been to court scores of times. We attended courts in Cookstown and Dungannon preliminary hearings. We've attended courts in Belfast to support the families. The families have led an admirable battle and done society, I would say, a great service in exposing what has happened. And many victims will see themselves in the context of this judgment yesterday. There aren't many days for victims of state violence to receive such a judgment, and particularly in these circumstances, and it's only but right. The rule of law has been applied, and somebody with a clean eye has now looking at this issue and examined all of the facts. It's not the RUC cover-up that happened, that's been addressed. Are these effective murders? That's exactly what they are. And so in some senses, when the family's been on that journey for 33 odd years, when they were going to courts, they were stopped and harassed. They were taken out of cars. And I think of one of the deceased, Seán O'Farrell, of his brother Austin, who had severe disabilities, who was in a wheelchair, severely disabled, and would have travelled in a special constructed vehicle to carry him to court. How he was oftentimes stopped by the British Army and the RUC at the side of the road, taken out of his wheelchair on one occasion. And the vile commentary and derogatory comments made about his brother and what happened to them, equally the other family members. So they've had to endure all of this, they've had to battle themselves, and very admirably, they've had this result. And now we see the vitriol again and the bile and the hate in social media and from certain politicians and public figures. People like Johnny Mercer, who's defended what's happened in Iraq, what's happened in Afghanistan, who's defended the British Army when they've killed children, civilians, men, women, priests, and now again trying to defend the indefensible, as they often do, and which he's made a career out of. We hear other politicians criticising this judge. This judge examined the facts in minute detail over a considerable period of time and made a verdict and a finding based on the evidence. And the comments that's been made about him are potentially libelous. But that said, you know, we're as an organisation also cognizant of all victims and survivors, of all the hurts by all of the actors of the conflict, all sides. And when I say all sides, I'm not talking about the kind of term all sides here, which is Republican and loyalist. I also include the British state and everything that they've been involved in, because they were at the heart of this, and the British government were at the heart of these killings. And other families will take comfort from this judgment. In one sense, it's a bittersweet moment, because they see themselves within this judgment of what happened to their loved ones too. And there needs to be reflection in this society for the people that are involved in the hate and the vitriol and the bile and the derogatory comments made about these 4 young men and their families and the outcome of this case. Because if we're a society that's going to move beyond conflict, we need to deal with justice, we need to deal with truth, and we need to deal with uncomfortable conversations around those issues. And yesterday a judge declared, based on the evidence, that these men were effectively murdered. Now the families will, with their lawyers, consider all of that. And in any other circumstance, if it was anyone else, there'd be calls for prosecutions. And that's probably where this probably needs to go to, because these soldiers were engaged in murder. And so in the context of all of this as well, we have the Legacy Act. And the purpose of the Legacy Act, when you listen to these veterans that don't want to be investigated and their cheerleaders, the consequence is, if we had the Legacy Act in place and these inquests had not concluded, that verdict would have been covered up by a Secretary of State and the Intelligence Services, because under the legislation, they would not publish anything that was damning to themselves, and they would use clauses like national security and not in the public interest to proceed and publish that. That's why open justice is important. That's why the rule of law is important. And that's why proper, effective investigation, not only into this incident that took place, that was completely unnecessary and completely avoidable, also into the failure to properly investigate it by the RUC at the time. And so that's the broader context in which this is framed. And here, this is a story about an argument about what the IRA done, and calls, look at the IRA and look what they've done. Yes, the IRA harmed people, and I acknowledge that, but I want people to reciprocate that the families of IRA people killed in the conflict, and killed unlawfully, and as in this incident, in the shoot to kill, summarily executions, and the use of lethal force that was casually done throughout the conflict, to reflect on those families and their views and their feelings and their rights to truth, their rights to justice. And that the truth, what happened to their relatives, is laid bare too. Because these 4 young men, had they been arrested and processed, and if they were sentenced and convicted, they would have been out within a few years because of the peace process. And there'd be men now in their mid-40s with their own families growing around them. And they've been denied that. And these families have fought for truth and justice, supported by ourselves, tooth and nail. And we're glad to stand beside them and do that. But along that journey, they've lost parents and siblings that haven't saw this moment. And that's a tragedy in itself. So before people want to hurl abuse and use social media and attack these families and vilify them at the time which they did when the men were killed, they need to step back and think about that. And they need to think about the hurt and the pain that the families of Republicans endured equally as much as anyone else endured. And if somebody reflects back, we did a report 15 years ago into these killings based on the evidence that we had access to and the disclosure of documents. And some international students that worked for us, legal students doing their masters, 2 of them have now moved on. One's a lawyer in Germany and the other was a prosecutor, and she is now a judge dealing with international war crimes. They assisted in that report and that research. And we determined that we would name that report Ambush, Assassination and Impunity, because that's what the evidence showed us. And the judges saw that evidence, and he said more or less the same thing.
And just on the vitriolic responses we have seen, some coming from leading Unionist politicians, given the relationship between democratic Unionists, and I say that in inverted commas, with loyalist paramilitaries, with the British state, and all the violence that came with that, do you think there's a sense of some cognitive dissonance with Unionist politicians? Why do you think that there's a kind of a different reaction to, you know, how we historically look at the past as Republicans as to Unionists view that history?
Well, there is some serious self-reflection, I think, that needs to take place, because there are double standards and hypocrisy. I'm quite comfortable to sit here and say that Republicans harmed people during the conflict and visited hurt and death on people who are left behind families, like the families of IRA, dead people as well, killed during the conflict. And so we have to humanise this as well. You know, the tears and the hurt and the pain of the parents of an IRA volunteer and their family, it's no different to the pain and the hurt and the tears of a loyalist paramilitary, a British soldier, an RUC person, or the vast majority of civilians who were killed in the conflict. You know, we need to humanise this as well. And so this sense of defending the indefensible and demonising people and certain individuals, whilst you stand with loyalist paramilitaries on one hand, that you walk in the political talks with them on the other hand, that they assist you in your elections, or you defend them, you know, all of that. You know, we need to get to a place where we can hear each other and we can understand. And the application of human rights and the rule of law and the foundation of justice and democratic principles is how we move away from conflict and build a new society. And if you don't want to listen to those institutions because they tell you through open justice within a British court what you don't want to hear, well then I fear for these people and their contribution that they can make in moving us out into new spheres of transitional justice, transitional society, and going forward. And I reflect back on the report that we did. We put the front picture on the report. And at the time, the family of Barry O'Donnell and Sean O'Farrell and Peter Clancy and Daniel Vincent, you know, they tried to bury their loved ones. And the photograph shows the small church in the graveyard, where the mourners attempt to go in with the coffins. And it's lined with several hundred police officers in full riot gear and armed. And that was to stop a flag being put on a coffin. And yet the dignity of those relatives in those moments is inspiring. It's a testament to human resilience, everything that they've endured. And yet again with the verdict, people don't want to listen to that, neither want to vilify the judge. And I really do think, in terms of the legacy of the past, between this Legacy Act, where the state want to hide its sins and use a smothering blanket of national security to prevent any exposure of what they were at, to stop judges in open courts finding the truth and revealing the truth. We've all of that to consider, and people need to reflect. A British Secretary of State needs to reflect. Politicians need to reflect. Society needs to reflect. You know, what messages are we sending to our children and our grandchildren? What hope are we giving for the future? These are important constructs and principles and matters that we need to grapple with. And we did, and we got to a place, and then the British government pulled the rug from under it in terms of the Stormont House Agreement, and they went down this route of amnesty for their own and their agents, and to cover themselves and to prevent the narrative of the truth about what they were involved in. And so we're in this phase where they're trying to shut down the courts because of these types of judgments. And we have this commitment by a Labour administration in opposition to repeal and replace. And now we see they're in the driving seat, and it seems about MI5 is driving this agenda with the security apparatus and the security kind of former security personnel. And the people need to really stand back and have an honest conversation about the hurt that was caused, the damage that's caused, the failure to lance those boils and deal with them in a constructive way in terms of the truths about the past. No more foundations of lies. Let's have the truth. Yesterday was a good day. People will find that difficult and challenging. but it was. And it goes to the heart of the nature, causes, and extent of the conflict that 4 young men in 1992 joined the IRA. They, for them, thought that was the only option. Now we've transformed society. Now we need to deal with the legacy of the past. And now we need to grapple with all of those issues in a real and meaningful way. Not through the bear pit or the pigsty of some of the debate shows and radios and TVs or the megaphone stuff that's full of vilification on social media. Deal with it constructively, positively as we can. Face into the hurt, face into the pain, and address it and recover and heal. And truth and justice and accountability are fundamental to those matters in terms of obtaining them.
I fully agree, Mark. I want to thank you for coming in today, because it's important that we have these conversations, and it's something that we will be focusing on a lot more on the conversation. So thanks again for coming in.